November 19th, 1944. Giebling, Lorraine. The Sherman M4A3 of Sergeant Ruben Rivers is sitting in a hedgeline at the eastern edge of a village of 40 houses and a bell tower. He is in the commander's hatch, reading the village through binoculars. The 88mm round that travels 0.3 of a second from a German pack gun 400 meters east opens the turret armor like paper. Rivers is killed instantly. He is 26 years old. He has refused morphine, and he has refused to leave that tank for 3 straight days. 2 of his crew survive. The gunner, on fire as he comes out of the loader's hatch, and the driver, who crawls into the ditch with his ears bleeding from the overpressure. Rivers does not get out. That is the moment that ends the story. It is not the moment the story is about. 6 weeks later, a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, filed by Rivers' company commander, Captain David J. Williams II, reaches General Patton's headquarters at Nancy. It comes back stamped in red ink. The denial will stand for 52 years. What Patton does with that folder, in his office in Nancy on the night of the 14th of December, is the moment the story is about. To understand what was buried at Lorraine American Cemetery, in Saint-Avold, in the spring of 1945, under one of more than 10,000 white crosses standing in lines that the wind has been pulling at ever since, you have to go back exactly 3 days. November 16th, 1944. A railroad crossing on the road from Borgeltroff to Giebling, at the eastern edge of the Saar Plain, where Patton's Third Army had pushed forward against the German First Army's hardest resistance since the Moselle. Rivers' tank platoon was leading the advance. The road was suspected of being mined. The map said it had been cleared. The map was wrong. The mine, by the after-action report a Teller anti-tank charge, in the order of 5 kilograms of explosive, went off under the right track of Rivers' Sherman. The track shed. The hull rocked but stayed upright. Rivers in the open hatch was thrown against the cupola ring. The fragment that opened his right leg from the knee to the hip was about the size of a man's fist. The femoral artery missed it by something under an inch. Rivers did not scream. The medic who reached him 3 minutes later, a corporal attached from the 14th Battalion Medical Detachment, whose name in this story I keep close to the form it appears in the Tresvant Anderson interview file, said many years later that what he remembered was not the wound. What he remembered was that Rivers did not stop giving orders. By the time the medic had cut the trouser leg and was reaching for the morphine syringe, Rivers had directed the 2nd tank in the platoon to cover the road shoulder, directed the 3rd tank to recover the dismounted crew of Tank 4, and confirmed that the platoon's radio frequency was still readable. He looked at the morphine in the medic's hand and shook his head. I have read that interview more than once. It is in the Anderson papers, the working files of Tresvant Anderson, the Black War correspondent who traveled with the 761st through the autumn and winter of 1944 and wrote the first book that anyone wrote about them. The handwritten note Anderson made at the bottom of one page reads, and I am quoting from the original, M is certain on this. No morphine. Rivers refused. Spoke clearly the entire time. The 761st Tank Battalion was the first black tank battalion to enter combat in the European theater. They had been activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, on the 1st of April, 1942, and trained for 2.5 years before deployment. The unit was nicknamed the Black Panthers. Patton requested them in person, by name, in the autumn of 1944, not assigned, requested, over the objections of an Army leadership that did not believe black soldiers should be in armor at all. The request itself is documented in the 3rd Army records. The reasoning Patton gave was operational, not political. The 761st was the best-trained black tank battalion the Army had, and the war needed them. The unit reported to 3rd Army at the end of October. A few days later, the war diary entry that survives in the typed log is dated the 2nd of November, though the date is not entirely unanimous across the sources, and the location named in different accounts shifts between a field east of Nancy and a meadow near the village of St. Nicolas de Port. Patton arrived to greet them in person. He stood on the deck of an M32 recovery vehicle. The men of the 761st were formed up below him. There were about 600 of them. Behind Rivers' company, there were several rows of officers from 12th Army Group's headquarters, white officers, who had argued in writing during the preceding 3 weeks that the unit was not ready, was not suitable, was not what 3rd Army needed. The transcript of what Patton said survives in the 3rd Army War Diary for that day. Men, you are the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you were not good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are. As long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches, everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down. The newsreel footage of the speech was filmed and then withheld. A memorandum from the relevant office at the War Department, dated less than 2 weeks after the speech itself, recommended that the footage not be released for civilian distribution. The transcript was first published in full in 1968, in the revised edition of Anderson's book, Come Out Fighting. The exchange this video is about, 6 weeks later, 3 weeks after Rivers was already in the ground at St. Avold, is a reconstruction in the spirit of Captain David J. Williams' surviving correspondence and the War Diary of 3rd Army staff for the 2nd week of December. The framing facts, the dates, the denial paperwork, the medal that finally came in the year 1997 are documented. If you came to this channel for stories of moral confrontation at the closing edge of the war, the subscribe button below this video is how you tell me to keep finding them. That is all I will ask. Now back to a medic kneeling in the road, holding a morphine syringe in his right hand and the cut trouser leg in his left. You need this, Sergeant. What I need is to be on my feet before dark. The medic pressed the issue. The wound was deep enough that he could see the inner surface of the femur. Movement of that limb without immobilization would risk shock, possible severance of the artery, possible loss of the leg. The morphine would dull the pain enough to permit evacuation by jeep to the regimental aid station, 4 kilometers back. Rivers asked him a single question: whether the morphine would put him out. The medic, the kind of man who told the truth in field circumstances, even when it was inconvenient, and this matters because plenty of them did not, said yes. The dose he was carrying would put him out for between 6 and 10 hours, depending on his metabolism. Rivers said, then no. Captain David J. Williams II arrived at the road 4 minutes later. Williams was the company commander of A Company, 761st Tank Battalion. He was 25 years old, white, a Yale graduate, the son of a Connecticut family that had not known a black soldier socially before Williams' deployment. He was Rivers' direct superior officer. He had been in the war for 2 months. Williams looked at the leg. He looked at Rivers' face. He gave the order to evacuate. Rivers refused the order. What happened in the next 40 seconds is the moment around which everything else in this story turns. Williams later said, in a letter to the Army's Awards Branch dated the 7th of February, 1973, 28 years after the fact, that he had given exactly 2 unlawful orders in his entire military career. The first was an order on a French farmhouse he had reason to believe contained civilians. The second was the order to Sergeant Ruben Rivers on the morning of November 16, 1944, to allow himself to be carried off the battlefield by a medic and a stretcher team. Rivers refused the second order the way a man refuses an indecent proposal, quietly, without heat, with a kind of formal disgust. He told Williams he would not leave his platoon under another sergeant the night before the next attack. He told Williams the dressing the medic was applying would hold. He told Williams that if his leg could carry him to the cupola, his leg would carry him until the platoon's objective was secure. Williams looked at the medic. The medic had finished the dressing. He shook his head, meaning, in the silent grammar that medics and officers had worked out by the autumn of '44. Meaning, yes, it will hold, but no, you should not let him. Williams was silent for a long moment. Then he rescinded the evacuation order. Rivers got back into his Sherman by climbing the right side of the hull, using the spare track links bolted to the sponson. His right leg was no longer taking weight. He went up the side of the tank with his arms. That night, after the platoon had pulled into lager at a farm half a kilometer south of the road, Williams sat in his command tent and wrote out the first draft of the recommendation that he would resubmit to the Army's awards branch every 2 to 3 years for the rest of his life. By the lamplight, he could see that his own hands were not steady. The envelope reached Patton's 3rd Army headquarters at Nancy in the second week of December. It came back stamped, across the top of the recommendation in red ink, in a hand the bureaucracy of the awards branch had refined over 4 years of war. Recommend denied. Insufficient evidence. Patton was alone in his office when he found the recommendation in the morning stack. The room at Nancy was on the 2nd floor of a requisitioned Hôtel Particulier, whose owners had been collaborators and who had quietly relocated to Switzerland the week before the Americans arrived. The light came in flat through tall windows that had no curtains. There was a coal stove in the corner that had not yet been lit that morning. The morning paperwork, recommendations, court-martial reviews, casualty rolls, requests for ammunition resupply, an undelivered memo from Bradley about fuel allocation, was in a stack about 4 inches deep on the right side of the desk. Patton worked from the top of the stack. The recommendation was approximately 14 pages down. He reached it at 20 minutes past 8. The red stamp was visible before he opened the folder. He read the recommendation once. He set it down. He picked it up. He read it twice. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, Hap Gay to his face, Hobart on the official paperwork, was in the outer office, looking through the previous day's situation reports. Gay's recollection of that morning, set down in his post-war correspondence, preserved in the Williams family papers, was that he heard Patton get up from the desk before he heard him say anything. The sound of Patton standing was a particular sound. Patton was a heavy man. The chair he used at Nancy had been pulled from a dining room of the same hotel. It was carved walnut, polished by 2 centuries of someone else's hands. When he stood, the chair feet shifted backward across the parquet about an inch, leaving 4 small scratches that the next occupant of the building would notice in March. Patton came to the door of the outer office in his stocking feet. His boots were still by the stove where the orderly had left them. He held the open folder. "Where is the officer who wrote this?" Gay looked at the signature. "Captain Williams, A Company, 761st. He'll be with the battalion. Forward area. Get him here." Gay tried to talk him out of it. The awards branch had already adjudicated the recommendation. The denial was final under standing procedure. Pulling a company commander out of the line for an interview about a denied Medal of Honor recommendation was, Gay used the phrase, in the same letter to Williams later, was the kind of thing that drew attention from the kind of people Patton already had enough attention from. Bradley would hear about it. So would Marshall. Patton listened to the whole argument. Then he said, "Get him here by tomorrow night. I want to look at the man who wrote this in person." Gay sent the runners. Williams was on the line at a forward CP near Hanskirch when the order reached him at 15:40 hours that afternoon. He hand-signed the chit acknowledging the order. The chit survives, folded once, watermarked along the lower edge, in the Williams papers at the Yale Manuscripts and Archives Library. The archivist who logs the folder for researchers notes, with a kind of academic patience, that the watermark is probably not from rain. It took Williams 30 hours to reach Nancy. He had to coordinate the handover of A Company to his executive officer, secure a jeep, find a driver who could be spared, and travel 120 kilometers of roads that the November fighting had turned into something that was no longer quite roads. He arrived at the hotel at 2200 hours on the 14th of December, about 30 hours, give or take, before the German 6th Panzer Army would begin the artillery preparation that opened the Battle of the Bulge. Patton was still in his office. He was working at a different stack now. Weather reports, Bradley's renewed memorandum about fuel, the situation maps that, in another 48 hours, would be the maps Patton used to plan the relief of Bastogne. The recommendation folder was on the corner of the desk where he had put it that morning. Williams was shown in by a captain from the duty staff. He was 25 years old. He had not slept since the night before the previous. He was wearing a wool field jacket that smelled of cordite and engine oil. His Yale graduation ring was still on his right hand. He saluted. Patton did not return the salute immediately. He looked at Williams for what Gay later called a long count of 3, possibly 4. Then he returned the salute and gestured Williams to the chair on the far side of the desk. "Sit down, Captain." Williams sat. I read your recommendation. I read it twice. I want to hear it from you." Williams said nothing for a moment. Or, to be exact, he later wrote, in a letter to his daughter dated the 8th of November, 1994, exactly 50 years after the events, that he could not remember saying nothing. He could remember the silence. He could not remember whether he had filled it or whether Patton had. What he did remember was that Patton waited. Patton did not prompt. Patton did not soften the silence with a question. Patton waited the way a man waits when he has decided the next sentence will not be his. Williams told him about the mine, the railroad crossing on the road to Giebling, the track shedding, Rivers thrown against the cupola ring, the leg laid open from knee to hip, the fragment about the size of a man's fist, the femoral artery missed by an inch. He told him about the medic and the morphine, about Rivers refusing the Surette because the dose would have put him out for 6 to 10 hours, and Rivers would not leave the platoon under another sergeant the night before the next attack. He told him about the order he had given, the evacuation order, and about how Rivers had refused it. He told him about rescinding the order. He told him about Rivers climbing back into the Sherman using his arms because the right leg was no longer taking weight. Patton listened without interrupting. He had his hands flat on the desk on either side of the folder. The morning light had moved across the floor and was now reaching the back of his chair. What did the wound look like that night? It looked worse, sir. The platoon lagered at a farm south of the road. The medic, the same corporal who had been on the road that morning, was checking him every 2 hours through the night. Every 2 hours. Yes, sir. He was running a fever. He was. The medic said it was, in the medic's words, a fever that argued with the dressing. What did Sergeant Rivers do during the fever? Williams paused. This was the part of the story he had told no one. Not even his daughter in the letter 50 years later would he tell this part in detail. He gave Patton the surface of it. He was awake almost all night. Sometime around 3, he asked the platoon's other sergeant, Sergeant McBurney, to bring him the situation map for the morning. McBurney brought it. Sergeant Rivers checked the platoon's positions. He moved one tank 20 meters east of where it had been pinned because there was better defilade. He moved another back 4 meters because of a low spot the morning fire would expose. He did this with the map on his stomach, in the dark, by feel and by the platoon's reading of the ground. In the dark. There was a small lamp. He covered it with a blanket. Why? Because the medic had said the light hurt his eyes. The fever had made his eyes hurt. Patton was silent. Gay later said, in the same letter to Williams, that Patton's hands on the desk did not move. Did Sergeant Rivers sleep? At about 4, for maybe an hour. Then morning came. Then morning came, sir. Williams went through the next day, the 17th. Rivers refusing again to be evacuated. The platoon's objective. The German positions east of Hanskirch. The second day in the open turret with the leg. He went through the 18th. The same thing. He went through the 19th, which was Gebling. The Sherman in the hedge line at the eastern edge of the village. The bell tower the Germans had used the previous week. The pack gun dug in along the Morville Road. The shell. The 2 surviving crew. The third. When Williams finished, the room was very quiet. Patton said, "You have given me 3 days, from the road to the bell tower. 3 days when this man could not put weight on his leg and would not leave his tank." Yes, sir. And the awards branch returned this recommendation with the words, "insufficient evidence," across the top in red. Yes, sir, in red. In red. Patton closed the folder. Captain, that stamp came from this office. Through this office. Not from me. From a clerk at the awards branch who has, as far as I am able to determine, never been within 60 kilometers of a Sherman with a hole in its turret. The clerk's pencil signature is the 3rd line, underneath the stamp. I saw it, sir. Then you know why you are sitting in this chair. Williams said nothing. Patton stood up. He moved to the window. The sleet had been falling on Nancy since late afternoon and had now turned to small, hard pellets that struck the glass in a sound like dry rice. He stood with his back to the room for what Gay later called the longest minute he ever spent in a room with George Patton. When Patton turned, he had the folder in his hand again. Captain Williams, I'm going to tell you why I asked for the 761st by name in October. I'm going to tell you what I told them at St. Nicholas on the 2nd of November. and I'm going to tell you what I want you to do with this folder when you leave this room. I'm going to do these things in that order. Sit down properly in that chair." Williams was already sitting. He sat further back. He sat the way a man sits when he understands that whatever is about to happen will not be repeated. Patton spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from where he was standing, with the folder in his right hand and the back of the leather chair touching the back of his calves. The sleet against the window was the only sound in the room that was not him. In October of '44, I wrote to the War Department, and I asked for a black tank battalion. The 761st was the only black tank battalion in the European theater. I asked for them because I had spent 18 months reading the training reports out of Camp Claiborne. I read the gunnery scores. I read the time on target data. I read the section on tank platoon leadership. The men of the 761st gunned and maintained and led at a standard the rest of the Army did not match. The letters I read were not opinions. They were numbers. The numbers said what they said. The Army would not deploy them. I asked for them anyway. He stepped closer to the desk. Not a threat, a deliberation. I asked for them because I have spent 30 years in this Army, and I have learned what the word soldier means. A soldier is a man who steps forward when there is no honor in stepping forward and no comfort in being asked. The men of the 761st had been training for 2.5 years to do a thing the Army would not permit them to do. They were being held in reserve in a war that needed them. That is not what a soldier is for. So I asked for them, and Marshall signed the order over objections he did not bother to put in writing. Williams said nothing. He had not been asked to. On the 2nd of November, I stood on the deck of a recovery vehicle in a meadow south of Nancy, and I said to them, "I would never have asked for you if you were not good. I have nothing but the best in my Army. I do not care what color you are." He paused. I said it because it was true. I have said many things in this war. Some of them I said because they needed to be said in the moment. Some of them I said because I was angry. That sentence I said because it was the truth, and the men in front of me needed to hear the truth. And the white officers behind them in row 2, the officers who had argued in writing for 3 weeks that the 761st was not ready, was not suitable, was not what 3rd Army needed, they needed to hear the truth as well. They heard it. Some of them flinched. I noted which ones. He brought the folder up to the lamplight. Sergeant Ruben Rivers heard that sentence. He heard it on the 2nd of November, and on the 16th of November, he refused a morphine surette, because morphine would have put him out, and his platoon would have gone into the morning under another sergeant. He climbed the side of his Sherman with his arms, because his right leg would no longer take weight. He commanded that platoon from the cupola of his tank for 3 days with a wound that should have killed him on the first day. On the morning of the 19th, he was killed by an 88 at 400 meters while reading a village through binoculars. Patton placed the folder back on the desk. A captain of the United States Army wrote out a recommendation that same night by lamplight. That recommendation came to this office stamped in red ink in a hand the awards branch has refined over 4 years of war. Insufficient evidence. The clerk who put that stamp on that paper has never seen the inside of a Sherman with a hole in its turret. He sat at a desk in Washington, and he wrote in red ink a thing that should not have been written, on a paper that should not have left his desk stamped that way at all. He looked at Williams. "Captain, you are going to take this folder. You are going to take it out of this room and out of this building. You are going to file your second recommendation, in writing, in your hand, with the dates and the names and the medic's account and what you saw with your own eyes. And you are going to file it through me. Not through the awards branch. Through me. You are going to do that because the man whose name is on the front of this folder did exactly what he was asked to do. And then he did more. The clerks in Washington will write what clerks in Washington write. I would not have asked for the 761st if they were not good. I asked for them, and they were better than I asked. That is the only thing in this folder that needs to be on the record. Get the rest on the record by morning." He stopped. The room was very quiet. "That is what I came back to this office tonight to say. Now you go and write it." Williams stood. He saluted. Patton returned the salute. Williams left the room, or rather was dismissed, in the technical sense of the verb, at 0 hours 19 on the morning of the 15th of December. At 0530 on the morning of the 16th of December, in the Ardennes forest 140 kilometers north of Nancy, the artillery batteries of the German 6th Panzer Army opened fire along a 60-kilometer front. Within 36 hours, Patton's Third Army would be ordered to disengage from the Saar and pivot 90 degrees north to relieve the encircled garrison